Booktube, welcome back to my channel. It is Monday, October 7th. This past weekend, the Booktube prize was announced, and I was a judge for the finals round. These are the 6 books that were finalists. So I'm going to tell you very briefly about my experience reading each of these 6 books and which book I ultimately chose as my winner and whether I accurately predicted the book that was ultimately awarded the inaugural Booktube prize. So I'm gonna go in order of how I read these books. The first book I read was There by Tommy Orange, and I read this one last year just because it was a new release and it was much hyped, and I was very intrigued by the synopsis when I first heard about it. This one follows families, members of Native American families through generations and events that split these families apart so that these family members didn't know each other, and it follows them as they make their way towards a reunion that they don't yet realize. And it's also tied to a cultural event in the Native American tradition called a powwow. So the author uses this idea of a powwow in its literal sense as well as its figurative sense, in that we have this conflagration, this coming together of very different parts that could be incendiary when they happen. And I really enjoyed this book. I liked how the author took all these various elements from the different generations, the different experiences that these individuals had in this Native American tribe, how they related to other members of their tribe, how they related to their surroundings, and how he traced that history throughout the ages and coming together in this modern meeting and what it meant for all these different people coming together. I planned to reread it around the time that I was reading all these other books, but I didn't get to rereading it. But I remember being awed by this book. And even though it's not a perfect novel, there are lots of flaws, this typical flaws that you find in a debut novel, I suppose. I still think that the author did a really good job in executing this story. And so I gave this one really high ratings, and I don't think a reread would change my experience of the book. Even though I've heard, controversial things about the story, I don't think it would change how I feel about the story myself. The next book I read from the pile was probably Fruit of the Drunken Tree by Ingrid Rojas Contreras. And this one also has some kind of an autobiographical tinge in that the author and the main character are both from the same place. They're both from South America, specifically Colombia. And the story in this one, we have a young girl who's growing up in a middle-class family in Colombia during the time of Pablo Escobar's notoriety as a drug dealer and a powerful drug lord. Through this story, we get a comparison between what it means to live in the middle class as well as what it means to live in the poorer working classes, and how both of these communities were affected by the corruption in the government as well as by the violence from the drug lords and from the police, and also violence from each other, how both of these communities were affected by those external circumstances. And the story itself, the plot was very interesting. I just really didn't enjoy the way it was written. And so even though I appreciated this as a story, it felt more like a memoir than a novel, and so this one didn't rank very high for me. So it was towards the bottom of my pile. The next book that I read was A Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, and this one took the story of Helen of Troy and the war with the Greeks and added some other female characters and show how each of these characters was impacted by the war that happened around them, how their family lives were destroyed when they were taken from their cities and taken as concubines, relationships that developed between them and the men who had conquered their cities, and ultimately shows how women's loyalties, I suppose, change from being in one relationship to being in another, and how women in general absorb a lot of the circumstances that they're faced with and how they overcome. What are some of the compromises that they have to make in order to survive? So kind of exploring the Stockholm syndrome, where when a person has been taken captive, what are some of the feelings that they develop for their captors? How do they process the violence that has been done to them? And what does it mean to be silenced versus to silence yourself? I really enjoyed a lot of the themes in this book. I felt like the author did a really good job in presenting that complexity of womanhood and servitude and enslavement. I really appreciated the themes in this book. I read this one almost in one setting. I remember reading it almost overnight because I was so engaged, so enraptured by the relationship that the author presented, that even though we had these very terrible characters, we were made to feel compassion for them. We were made to feel empathy for them. And so I thought that this was a really well executed story, and I gave this one high ratings. I'm telling you that I gave them high ratings, so you're gonna be able to kind of intuit how I rated these books. The next one that I read from this stack was A Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne, and this one follows a really terrible writer who wants to be a writer, really wants to be a famous novelist. He wants to be a successful novelist, but while he has the ability to craft sentences, he just doesn't seem to have the ability to conceive of ideas to compose a plot. And so he seeks out relationships with other people, other writers, other famous people, who he can take the stories that they have already written, whether in their lives or in their head, and kind of appropriate them for himself. So over the course of many years and a series of relationships, the author John Boyne kind of gives us a little bit of introspection into the benefits of forming certain alliances, and asks the reader to ponder the question of who a story belongs to, and ultimately whether this main character is as terrible as he seems, or is he justified in what he does. And while this main character is probably one of the worst characters you've ever read in fiction, the book was so engaging. The story, the plot, the theme was just so well presented that it was hard not to love this book. So I gave this one high ratings when I rated it for, I think, the semifinals round as well. And then we have the two books that were new to me for the finals round, and that was Happiness by Aminata Forna and A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza, which was the last book that I read. So I'll talk about this one first. The plot of this one is pretty simple. There are two storylines. One is that there are these wild animals that have taken to living in the cities, and the author goes through a lot of explanation for why these wild animals, wolves, foxes, coyotes, why they have left their what seems to be their natural habitat, and why their presence is increasing in these metropolitan areas. She also takes these human characters, people who have come from other places, and shows how they themselves have been transplanted and what it means to move. What are some of the things that one leaves behind, and what are some of the things that one hopes to find in a new city, in a new environment. And I liked the juxtaposition of these two different kinds of storylines, where we're examining animal characters as well as human characters who pretty much seem to want the same thing and are looking for the same kind of release. And one of the main characters in here is a woman who's studying these wild animals, and so through her research we get a lot of introspection into the habits of these wild animals, as well as she's very in tune with them, so she gives a little bit of an explanation of their whys, their motives. That for me was really interesting. But what brought this book down for me a little bit was the romantic relationship that the author then tried to feed us, where this woman, this researcher, developed a romantic relationship with a man that she met just on the streets of London, and there was a lot about their relationship that just didn't ring true. So while I really liked the themes, I really liked the comparison between wild animals becoming kind of domesticated and looking for family, looking for, maybe not family, but looking for a place to belong in this new city, in this new environment that was so different from where they came from. I felt like part of the relationship that the author tried to sell me didn't feel authentic, and so it brought the book down for me in that way. last book that I read for judging the finals of the Booktube Prize was A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza. And this one follows an Indian family over the course of many years. So we watch the children grow up and develop relationships outside of their home, and how those relationships are monitored by their parents, because their parents are very traditional and they have an idea of what they want their children to turn out to be, what kind of families they want their children to marry into. And so these parents try to manipulate their children's lives even from the time they're very young. And ultimately, when the children grow up, they of course have very different ideas of what they want for their own lives. And so there is some tension between the children and their parents. There's lots of tension between the children and their parents. And while these parents appear to be religious and very traditional and very conservative in their values, the author also exposes a lot of the lies that they live, a lot of the inconsistencies with their religious beliefs, how they practice what they do. Through a series of events which are outside of any kind of chronology, we visit and revisit events from this family's past and present, and see the same situation, see the same experience through the eyes of different family members, and show how the family life led to being estranged and their attempts to reconnect and to reunite. I really liked a lot of things about this book. I enjoyed the way the author played with time. I like how she explored the favoritism that the parents played, as well as the jealousy that the children felt towards each other. I like how she showed the destructive effects of those two things, as well as I really liked the way we looked at the same event from multiple perspectives, and it felt like we got a chance to judge for ourselves what was happening on these pages. So how the author tackled this story is what really made this story really valuable for me. I thought that this was a really good look at families and the complexity of being a part of a family. I think that's why I rated it as high as I did. So these are the 6 books, and I've given you a little bit of a sneak peek into how I felt about the books. The first time I judged for the Booktube Prize, it was the quarterfinals round, and I'd come up with a series of questions that I wanted to ask myself on how I would rate these books to compare them with each other. And based on my rating scale, I won't go through the individual ratings anymore, but I will link my blog post in the description box down below if you'd like to see how I rated each individual book based on that 6-question scale. You can go check out that link. But I'll just tell you that based on my answers to those 6 questions, this is how each of the books ranked for me. My least favorite was Fruit of the Drunken Tree, bettered only slightly by Happiness by Aminata Forna. In 4th place, I had A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza. In 3rd place, I had Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. And I was a little torn between my 1st and 2nd place wins. But I thought that There There by Tommy Orange was slightly more deserving of the prize than A Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne. So I gave this my #1 pick, and I call this my #2 book. And if you've watched the announcement video, you know that this is the book that won the inaugural Booktube Prize. So if I had gone just a little bit different, I would have picked the winner. But I thought that this was a really great read. I recommend it. If you haven't read Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne yet, I suggest that you pick this up. I first got this like February last year, and it sat on my shelf for a year before I finally read it. So I was glad that the Booktube Prize made me pick this one up off my shelves, and now it's going to have pride of place because this is the winner of the inaugural Booktube Prize. I'm gonna ask Robert to get some stickers made so I can get a sticker on this book that says Booktube Prize winner, because I like to have prize-winning books on my bookshelf. So that was the Booktube Prize, the inaugural Booktube Prize. Robert has already announced a call for judges for next year's prize. He's hoping to extend the prize to not just fiction, but also non-fiction for the next year. And so because we will be increasing the books to be considered, we're also looking for more judges. And I say we because I, of course, want to continue to be associated and affiliated with the prize. So I'm looking forward to reading new releases for next year as well. And I invite you to check out the link. I'll link the Booktube Prize website down below, as well as Barter Horde's channel, which is Robert's channel, where he talks a lot about the prize and his experience with it. So thanks for watching this video. Give me a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to see more. Let's talk in the comments. I'd love to know about your experience with the Booktube Prize, if you were a fan, or if you were a judge, or if you just follow the prize online, or if you haven't heard about it before. If this is your first time hearing about the Booktube Prize, I'll also link my previous videos where I judged other rounds, so you can learn a little bit more about the prize and tell me what you think about it. So we'll talk in the comments, and until next time, happy reading. Bye.